Tonight, let the fire crackle softly beside you as the world outside fades into stillness. You're about to drift through a quiet piece of history, a night when the world froze and humanity learned to endure. The story won't rush you. It will simply flow, slowly, like snow falling under a silver moon. Before we begin, from where are you listening tonight? Is it already late where you are, or are you just settling in? Before we go further, if you enjoy calm stories like this, gentle tales of history to fall asleep to, you can softly tap like and subscribe and share where you're listening from. It truly helps keep these quiet stories alive. The winter began without warning. A few cold mornings, a thin crust of frost that refused to melt. Farmers spoke of strange winds from the north, and rivers carried slivers of ice long before their time. At first, people thought it was only a season passing through. No one yet knew that this chill would last far longer than any before it. Each day felt slower. The sound of footsteps on frozen soil echoed like distant memories. Children watched their breath rise like smoke in the morning air. Even the animals grew quieter, huddled close to the warmth of their dens. The sun rose weakly, barely touching the land before fading away again. The people began to notice something unusual, the way their shadows shortened sooner, the way their fires seemed smaller. They wrapped themselves in what little they had, worn furs, coarse blankets, and hope. The scent of wood smoke lingered everywhere, a reminder that warmth was now the most precious thing on earth. You might imagine that sound, the faint hiss of burning wood, the pop of embers. That was the sound of life itself during that winter. It was the heartbeat of every village, every home. And when the wind howled, people listened carefully, as though the world itself was breathing with them. The rivers that once sang with water now whispered no more. Thick layers of ice silenced their movement. Fishermen tested the surface with trembling hands, afraid it might swallow them whole. Beneath that frozen shell, water still flowed, unseen, but alive, much like the quiet faith of those who refused to give up. Some nights, the sky itself felt heavy. Clouds hung low, pressing down on rooftops and forests. Snow fell so thick that the line between earth and sky disappeared. The world became one color, pale, endless, and strangely peaceful. There was fear, yes, but also a strange beauty in the quiet. If you're listening to this while lying down, let your breath slow with the rhythm of that silence. Just as those people learned to slow their movements, to conserve warmth and energy, you too can let your body rest. The cold outside their walls became a teacher, reminding them that survival was not about strength, but patience. Villages began to shrink inward. People gathered closer around fires, speaking less and listening more. They shared soft stories, not of heroes or victories, but of small kindnesses, a loaf of bread shared, a door left open, a candle burning through the night. In the heart of cold, humanity warmed itself with compassion. Days turned into weeks. The frost deepened. Even tools grew brittle and broke under strain. Metal froze to touch, wood cracked with sound like thunder. But each morning, someone would step outside to check the horizon, a simple act of hope, repeated again and again, even when nothing changed. There were no great leaders commanding survival. There were only families, neighbors, quiet people doing what they could. They learned how to burn slower fires, how to use stones to trap heat, how to rest together to share body warmth. The world had turned hostile, yet people found peace in the smallest acts. Every few nights, the northern sky would shimmer faintly, not in color, but in motion, like soft lights breathing above the earth. It reminded them that even in the longest cold, there was still beauty. They called it a gift of the night, a reminder that hardship never arrived without purpose. If you've begun to feel drowsy, that's all right. Let this story move like winter wind, gentle, unhurried. There's no need to stay alert. The people of that time didn't rush. They learned that time itself had slowed for them. You can rest along with them, safe inside this quiet part of history. The nights were long enough to forget what day looked like. The sun would rise only for a breath, painting the snow in soft gold before vanishing again. In that brief light, people would gather outside, lift their faces to the sky, and whisper gratitude for one more sunrise. The coldest winter in history had arrived, and yet life continued, quietly and patiently. As the cold deepened, even the sound of human life grew faint. Voices carried differently through frozen air, softer, almost musical, as though the cold itself was listening. It was in this silence that people learned the language of survival, a language of quiet gestures, shared looks, and unspoken strength. Inside small homes, families adapted to a rhythm shaped by the frost. The day began before sunrise, when the embers were stirred and fed with the last pieces of wood. Every spark mattered. The warmth it gave was brief, but enough to start another day. And as the smoke curled upward, it marked a victory. Another morning survived. When the snow grew too deep to travel, the world seemed to fold in upon itself. The nearest neighbor might be only a short walk away in summer, but now that distance felt like another land. Messages were sent not by words, but by signals of smoke, by trails in the snow, or by small gifts left at the edge of a path. You can almost picture it now, the white stillness stretching endlessly outside the door, the faint glow of firelight flickering through windows. There's something strangely peaceful in that image, isn't there? Even through hardship, life had found its rhythm, soft and deliberate, like your own breathing as you drift further into rest. Food grew scarce, and yet, no one ate alone if it could be avoided. A single pot of stew could feed several families, stretched thin with melted snow and quiet prayer. Hunger was an uninvited guest, but so was generosity. People learned that warmth wasn't just from the fire, it was from kindness, too. The cold did not take everything. It preserved. It slowed decay, kept food longer, made people resourceful. Even the air felt cleaner, sharper. Some would step outside just to feel it on their face, to remind themselves that they were still alive. It was painful, yes, but it was proof that they endured. Sometimes, the nights felt too long. Children would wake and ask when morning would come. Parents didn't have an answer, so they told them gentle stories about the earth sleeping under the snow, about the sun preparing to return stronger than before. These weren't legends, just comforts, ways to make patience bearable. If your eyes feel heavier now, that's perfectly fine. Just breathe slowly, as if you're part of that frozen village, surrounded by the quiet sound of wind against the walls. In that place, time doesn't rush. You are safe, and history is simply waiting beside you, whispering softly through the cold. When animals ventured near, it was both danger and relief. A deer might mean food, a wolf, warning. But the balance was clear. The land belonged to all who endured it. People hunted only what was needed, careful not to waste what little life remained in the snow. The cold had made everything sacred in its stillness. The days without sunlight blurred together. Without clocks or shadows, people learned to measure time by the rhythm of the fire, when it burned high, when it dimmed, and when only ash remained. Even that ash had purpose. It lined the walls of hearths, insulating the warmth that refused to die. Somewhere, deep in that endless season, came a moment of acceptance. The cold was no longer an enemy. It was a teacher, one that demanded stillness, patience, and faith in tomorrow. Those who fought against it grew weary, but those who learned to move with it found peace. From time to time, travelers passed through, messengers wrapped in layers of cloth, faces hidden, eyes bright with frost. They brought no grand news, only quiet reassurance that others still lived, that villages still stood, that no one was truly alone in this vast silence. If you listen closely now, imagine the sound of that wind, low, steady, almost like a breath beside your ear. It's the same wind that once swept across frozen fields centuries ago. And though it was fierce then, tonight it's gentle, helping you rest as you listen to their story. The first thaw was so subtle that many didn't notice. Ice cracked softly along the riverbanks. Roofs began to drip, one drop at a time, like distant chimes. And for the first time in months, the scent of earth returned. People stepped outside, blinking into the light, uncertain if it was real. They had survived the silent arrival of the endless cold, not through power or conquest, but through patience, kindness, and quiet endurance. The coldest winter in history had taken much, but it had given something, too. A reminder that warmth is not only in fire, but in the hearts that choose to share it. So, as you lie there, perhaps hearing the soft hum of your own surroundings, remember this. Even in history's deepest winters, people found peace in small things, a flame, a shared meal, a moment of stillness. Let that same calm fill your night, and rest knowing that you, too, are wrapped in warmth, even as the world outside grows quiet. The cold did not leave quickly. It sank deeper into the land, filling every crack of wood, every breath of air, every thought that dared to hope for warmth. The people had already learned stillness, but now they had to learn endurance. Fires burned smaller, weaker. Wood that once caught easily now hissed and smoked, refusing to give its full heat. Every ember was precious, a fragile sun in the heart of winter. Houses were no longer just homes. They became living shelters, carefully tended to as if they could feel pain. Walls were thickened with mud, straw, and snow pressed tight to block the wind. Windows were covered with cloth and hide, the light dim and golden. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke, but it was the kind of smoke that meant safety. Survival had taken the shape of shadows flickering on walls. Each morning began the same. Someone would rise before dawn to stir the ashes, searching for any spark that had survived the night. It was a small ritual of hope, a sign that life had not yet given in. When the fire caught, the glow spread across the room like quiet joy. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was enough to make people smile again, even for a heartbeat. Outside, the forest stood silent, their branches weighed down with frost. Gathering wood had become a dangerous task. The snow swallowed sound and distance, hiding paths and traps alike. Those who ventured out tied ropes from door to tree, guiding their way home. Each log they carried back was a victory, each armful a promise of one more warm night. In the evenings, the sound of splitting would echo faintly through the villages. It was rhythmic, patient, and strangely soothing. The people had grown used to the sound. It was part of life now, like breathing. Even children learned to listen for it, the quiet signal that someone, somewhere, was keeping the fire alive for everyone. There were tricks passed down through whispers, how to build a fire that burned slow, how to dry wood by keeping it under the bed, how to save heat by sleeping close together under shared blankets. These were not grand inventions, but they kept people alive. The smallest wisdom carried the greatest warmth. At night, homes glowed like tiny lanterns scattered across the wide earth. From above, they would have looked like constellations, human stars shining against the endless dark. And though the cold wind howled across the plains, inside those walls, people were calm. They had created their own constellations of survival. The human body adapts, even to suffering. People learn to move slower, to breathe through scarves to warm the air before it reached their lungs. Hands grew rough, faces red with windburn, but their spirits softened. No one expected comfort anymore. They simply expected tomorrow, and that was enough. Some nights, the fire dimmed earlier than usual, and people sat together in the dark, speaking softly. They didn't talk about the cold. There was no need. Instead, they spoke of memories, of gardens in spring, of laughter in warmer times. The past became a blanket of its own, covering them with the warmth of what once was. When exhaustion came, it came gently. People slept beside the embers, their dreams filled with soft sounds, the crackle of wood, the distant moan of wind. They did not dream of escape, only of peace. The mind learned to rest even when the body shivered. Sleep became a survival skill, a quiet rebellion against the cold. Sometimes there were visitors, travelers seeking warmth or food. Doors opened not with fear but with welcome. Whatever was inside was shared, no matter how little it was. In such times, the fire did more than heat the air, it connected hearts. The warmth that passed between people was stronger than any flame. If you were there, you would notice how quiet everything felt. The cold had stripped away all noise, all rush. Life had become simple. Breathe, endure, share. In that simplicity, people found something they hadn't expected: peace. The world outside might be frozen, but inside, something gentle had begun to thaw. The forest eventually began to change. The snow no longer fell endlessly. Instead, there were pauses, moments of still air. Hunters began to see animals again, weak but alive. It was as if the world itself had grown tired of holding its breath. And though the cold still ruled, it had lost its grip slightly, just enough to offer hope. Every fire told a story. Each one carried the memory of struggle, of hands that gathered, of hearts that refused to stop trying. The smoke that rose from chimneys wasn't just a sign of warmth. It was proof that life continued, quietly, faithfully. The world might freeze again someday, but people had already learned its secret. Endurance glows, even in darkness. If you close your eyes now, imagine that faint orange light, the sound of gentle crackling, the steady rhythm of breathing beside a dying flame. That's how they lived, not with abundance, but with presence. And in that presence, they found what the cold could never take, the quiet strength of being alive. The deeper the winter grew, the more creative people became. They discovered that stones, once heated by the fire, could hold warmth for hours. Families would place them beneath blankets or near their feet while they slept. Simple things became precious, not because they were new, but because they worked. In these quiet acts of care, people found comfort that words could never give. When the wind rose at night, it sounded like the voice of the earth itself, slow, deep, and endless. Some said it was a reminder of how small humanity truly was, yet how strong. The wind stripped away weakness, leaving behind a core of patience. It taught them that even when everything shakes, you can remain steady within yourself. The old and the young shared space near the fire. The youngest learned silence, listening to the stories whispered in low tones. The elders shared not tales of glory, but lessons: how to find water under snow, how to make oil from seeds, how to read the frost on windows to tell if the storm would ease. Every word carried survival. In that frozen world, noise felt wrong. Even laughter was softer, like a candle's flicker in darkness. People spoke slowly, so their breath wouldn't freeze in the air. They learned to read expressions more than sounds. In the hush of cold, every look, every smile, every shared blanket spoke louder than any sentence. At times, the fire would fail completely. Smoke would thin to nothing, and cold air would creep in like water. That moment was always heavy, the breath catching, the quick movement to relight the spark. It wasn't panic, just urgency. Fire was more than warmth now. It was life itself, glowing faintly in a fragile circle of light. Beyond the villages, animals moved quietly through the frost. Tracks appeared in the snow, foxes, deer, even small birds searching for seeds. People followed them carefully, not to harm them, but to learn from them. How they moved, how they endured. Nature had become the greatest teacher of all, whispering lessons to anyone willing to listen. Inside the homes, routines began to blend together. Day and night lost their difference. People ate when they could, slept when they were warm enough, woke when the fire needed tending. Time had melted into rhythm, the rhythm of survival, slow and steady, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. There were moments of quiet beauty, even then. A single candle flickering against frost-covered glass. The glow of moonlight turning snow into silver. The way a small child's laughter echoed through still air, cutting through the cold like sunlight. In these fleeting moments, life felt lighter, even holy in its simplicity. If you're listening now, imagine yourself beside that fire, the soft crackle, the warmth brushing your skin, the faint hum of a world frozen in silence. In that place, time doesn't matter. You can rest. You can simply exist, as they did, waiting for the storm to pass. The calm they found was not after the struggle, but within it. When supplies ran low, people began to share without being asked. One family would give flour, another would offer dried herbs. In return, someone else would lend strong arms to chop wood or fetch water. They didn't call it charity. It was simply what humans did when they remembered that survival is a shared language. As weeks passed, the cold began to feel like an old companion. It was still harsh, still painful, but familiar. People stopped fearing it and started respecting it. They learned when to move, when to rest, when to speak, when to stay silent. In that rhythm, they found something that felt close to wisdom. Sometimes, when the night sky cleared, people would gather outside for a few moments just to look up. The stars felt closer, sharper, as if they were carved into the sky. The vastness didn't frighten them anymore. It reminded them that their struggle was part of something much greater, a balance between cold and warmth, stillness and motion. If your breathing has slowed by now, let it. You are listening to the same kind of quiet they lived through, not empty silence, but peaceful stillness. The same peace that filled their homes when the fire finally caught, the same sigh that escaped when the wind softened for the first time in weeks. When the thaw began to whisper at the edges of the land, no one celebrated. They simply watched. Ice cracked softly, roofs dripped, and smoke rose higher as the air lightened. It wasn't triumph, only relief, the kind that doesn't shout, but exhales gently, thankful for one more sunrise. And so, the people who survived that season did not remember it for the pain, but for the warmth they created despite it. They learned that even in the longest cold, light can live in small things, in shared breath, in quiet kindness, in the promise that no winter, no matter how endless it seems, can last forever. The deeper the frost settled, the more silent the fields became. Once, these lands had hummed with the rhythm of tools, footsteps, and laughter. Now, they lay beneath a white shroud, frozen earth, sleeping seeds, and silence thick enough to hear your own heartbeat. It wasn't the kind of silence that frightened. It was the kind that reminded people how fragile life could be. The harvest had failed long before winter's peak. Stalks turned brittle before ripening, and roots clung to the ground like stone. The people who had lived by the rhythm of planting and reaping were left with nothing but empty barns and fading memories of color. Grain stores grew smaller, and each handful of flour was weighed like treasure. Every crumb mattered. Still, no one gave up. The cold had already taught them endurance, and now it would teach them creativity. People searched for whatever the frost had missed, wild roots hidden beneath snow, frozen berries still clinging to bare branches, and fish trapped beneath thick ice. Each discovery was small, but every meal was a victory. The markets were gone, the trade routes buried under snow. Barter became simple and direct, a basket of dried herbs for a loaf of bread, a handful of seeds for a strip of dried meat. There was no greed left in the world then, only survival shared in quiet understanding. The measure of wealth was warmth, and warmth was food. You could walk through those frozen villages and see how resourceful people had become. They built small cellars beneath their floors to store what little they had, wrapping food in cloth to keep it from freezing solid. The smell of smoke and dried vegetables filled the air, a reminder that life, though thin, still persisted. The rivers, though silent, still offered hope. People learned to break the ice in certain places, dropping handmade traps beneath the surface. They waited, patient and still, as the current moved below. A single fish caught after hours of waiting could feed a family that night. The sound of a frozen line snapping was the sound of salvation. Those who could no longer farm turned to gathering. They foraged for bark they could grind into powder, mixing it with flour to stretch the last of their bread. It was bitter, but filling. The act of making it, of kneading, baking, and sharing, felt sacred in its own way. It reminded them that even hunger could not erase community. When food grew scarcer still, some learned to use snow itself. Melted carefully, it became clean water for boiling grains or softening dried roots. Even the simplest act of turning ice into something drinkable felt like a small miracle. In those days, gratitude was not loud. It lived in small sighs and quiet prayers of thanks to the one who gives life. The air was filled with the scent of burning wood, smoke clinging to clothes and hair. It was a smell of survival. People didn't mind it. They had stopped caring about appearances. Every mark of soot was proof of another day endured, another meal shared by the faint warmth of the fire. The animals, too, had their role. Chickens stopped laying eggs, cows gave less milk, but they stayed close to their keepers, sharing the warmth of the barns. In those dim shelters, people and animals breathed the same frosty air, bound by the same will to endure. Life had grown simpler, a partnership against the cold. In the rare hours of sunlight, villagers worked quickly. They gathered snow to melt later, repaired walls, and checked on neighbors. It wasn't the season for work, yet they worked anyway. Action gave warmth, not just to their bodies, but to their spirits. Movement meant defiance against stillness. If you were there, you might see them moving slowly through fields that once glowed gold in summer. Now they were oceans of white, broken only by footprints and the black stumps of forgotten crops. Yet even there, people searched for roots, for hope, for anything that reminded them that spring would return. When someone found something edible, it was shared quietly, almost reverently. There was no celebration, no shouting, only silent gratitude and the sound of fire crackling as the meal was cooked. Hunger had turned food into something sacred, not in ritual, but in meaning. Every bite was a reminder of the mercy that still lingered. Some families turned to preserving what they could, drying thin strips of meat over the fire, wrapping berries in cloth, storing everything high and dry. These small efforts built a fragile sense of safety, a sense that tomorrow might be kind enough to allow them another sunrise. And through all of it, they learned one simple truth: survival was not found in abundance, but in patience. The frozen harvest had taken their crops, but not their will. They couldn't control the earth, but they could choose not to surrender. And in that quiet defiance, surrounded by snow and silence, warmth began to grow again, not in the soil, but in their hearts. The longer the frost lingered, the more careful people became with every grain they owned. A single loaf of bread might last 3 days, cut into thin slices and shared with slow reverence. Mealtime was no longer about hunger. It became a ritual of gratitude, for survival, for family, for one more day. The cold had stripped away luxury, but it had revealed meaning in the simplest acts. At night, when hunger crept into the silence, people distracted themselves with conversation. They spoke about past summers, when fields stretched green and endless. The stories warmed the room more than the fire did. Memory became a kind of nourishment, not for the body, but for the soul. In remembering, they reminded themselves that warmth had once existed, and it would return again. The snow outside gleamed under the pale moon, reflecting light into the narrow windows. Inside, shadows moved slowly across the walls, swaying with the flicker of firelight. Children drew pictures in the soot, marking imaginary harvests, fields, baskets, fruits they had never seen but still dreamed of. Hope lived in their drawings, delicate yet steady. Sometimes, traders from distant places arrived, their carts half empty, faces hidden beneath frost. They brought salt, dried beans, or old tools to repair broken ones. In exchange, they took furs, candles, and whatever people could spare. These moments broke the stillness of the season, brief meetings where life reached out through the cold and touched another hand. The old men of the villages became keepers of knowledge. They remembered winters past, though none so fierce as this, and taught others how to store food longer, how to ferment milk, how to use herbs that strengthened the body. Their words carried calm authority, spoken slowly, as though time itself listened. Their wisdom was the warmth that didn't fade. You could feel the rhythm of life had changed. There was no rush, no noise, no waste. Every task, from stirring a pot to sweeping ash, was done with quiet intention. The people had learned to live slowly, as though moving too fast might shatter the fragile peace they had built against the cold. Outside the villages, the forests began to shimmer with faint signs of thaw. Icicles dripped during the day and froze again at night, creating music only the patient could hear. The trees, though bare, held secrets beneath their bark, sap waiting to rise, buds waiting to wake. Nature was whispering that endurance had meaning. And yet, food remained scarce. Some families went days with only thin broth, others shared a single potato among many. Still, no one starved alone. The bond between neighbors had grown stronger than hunger itself. To see another survive was to feel hope for yourself. It was a silent pact, an agreement written in frost and smoke. There were moments of weakness, 2. Nights when the wind was too harsh, or when a cupboard stood empty. In those hours, people prayed quietly for relief, not for riches or plenty, just for warmth, for a sign that the storm would pass. And often, it did, not through miracles, but through the simple mercy of morning. Sometimes, the first light of dawn caught on the frozen fields and turned them gold for a brief moment. People would stand at their doors, eyes half closed, breathing the icy air. For that instant, it almost felt like summer again, not in the world around them, but in their memories. That memory kept them alive. The frozen harvest had become a story in itself, not of failure, but of endurance. It showed that when the earth gives nothing, people still find ways to give to each other. It was not abundance that made them rich, but unity. Their wealth was the warmth they shared. If you imagine it now, the smell of smoke, the creak of wood, the faint hum of life beneath the snow, you might feel the peace that settled over those villages. It was not joy, but a calm deeper than joy, the quiet pride of those who endured without complaint. Weeks later, when the first signs of spring arrived, no one cheered. They simply stood in silence and watched as the ice retreated from the rivers. It was not victory they felt, but gratitude, a humble acknowledgement that the season had passed and they had remained. As the first shoots of green pierced the snow, the people smiled softly. Their hands were weak, their bodies thin, but their spirits unbroken. The land had rested, and now, so could they. What was lost would return, in time. What mattered was that they had held on long enough to see it. And so, when history remembers the frozen harvest, it does not speak of despair. It speaks of quiet courage, of fires kept alive against impossible odds, of hearts that refused to freeze. The cold took the world for a season, but warmth, in its quiet way, won in the end. The rivers, once alive with motion, had fallen silent. Their voices, once a song of constant flow, were buried beneath layers of ice that glowed pale beneath the winter sun. Villages built along their banks had always lived by that rhythm: water for their crops, fish for their meals, a path for their trade. But now, the rhythm was gone. The stillness of the rivers was more than quiet. It was absence itself, a deep and endless pause that swallowed sound and time alike. People stood at the edges and stared into the white surface, remembering what movement once felt like. The fishermen were the first to return, carrying their tools like relics of a forgotten world. They cut through the ice, slow and careful, their breath-forming clouds in the frozen air. Beneath them, the water still moved, unseen, but alive. That hidden current became a symbol of hope. The world above might be frozen, but somewhere below, life continued to whisper. The men would listen for that sound, the faint gurgle beneath the ice, as if the river itself was breathing softly in its sleep. Each hole carved into the ice became a small gateway between two worlds, the frozen one above and the moving one below. People began to gather around those openings, waiting for fish, for signs, for reminders that nature still lived. The work was hard, the cold merciless. Yet they found comfort in the rhythm, the sound of axes striking ice, the echo of wood against water, the occasional splash that broke the silence. These were no longer just labors of necessity. They were rituals of hope, keeping hearts steady while the world stood still. At night, the river looked like glass. The moon painted it silver, and the stars shimmered across its surface, unmoving and perfect. Children were warned not to walk too far, for the ice could crack without warning. But some did, curious, fearless, and listened for the sounds beneath their feet, the deep groans of pressure, the whispers of water pushing through narrow veins of life. To them, it felt like standing above a sleeping giant, powerful and patient, waiting for spring to wake it. The people learned to use the river's silence. They built paths across its surface, connecting one village to another. What had once divided them now united them. Carts rolled slowly over the ice, carrying wood, food, and letters of comfort. The frozen water became a road, dangerous, but necessary. In its stillness, it offered new ways to survive. And in that transformation, there was something quietly miraculous. If you could stand there, feeling the cold bite through your gloves, hearing the crunch of snow underfoot, you might understand what they felt. Fear, yes, but also wonder. The world had become fragile, transparent. Every step was uncertain, yet beautiful. The ice held them, carried them, and threatened them all at once. It was nature's paradox, breathtaking and cruel in equal measure. Some nights, when the air was clear, the villagers could hear the river sing. It wasn't a melody, but a hum, low, deep, and resonant, rising through the frozen surface like the earth itself was speaking. They said it was the sound of strength, the reminder that even beneath stillness, movement never truly stopped. That hum lulled them to sleep, mingling with the crackle of their fires and the whisper of the wind against their doors. The fishermen adapted their craft. Instead of casting nets, they used long spears and narrow traps lowered through ice holes. They worked slowly, patiently, in silence. Every pull of the line felt like a conversation, a call and answer between human endurance and nature's mercy. Sometimes they caught nothing for days, but they never stopped trying. Faith, after all, is not built on certainty but on effort. When fish were caught, they were treated as treasures. Families gathered to clean, cook, and share them. The meals were humble, a small fire, a pot, and quiet laughter. Steam rose into the cold air, carrying warmth to anyone nearby. Those moments felt sacred, not because they were grand, but because they were honest. The river had given again, and in return, the people offered gratitude. There were also dangers. The ice could shift suddenly, splitting without warning. A single step too far, and the world beneath could swallow a person whole. So they learned caution, to move slowly, to read the patterns in the ice, to listen for warning cracks. Fear became a companion, not an enemy. It kept them alive, attentive, humble before creation's power. Sometimes, when the storms passed and the air grew still, the frozen river reflected the world above perfectly. Every tree, every star, every faint light from a distant house. Looking into it felt like looking into another world, a mirror of silence. People said that if you stared long enough, you could almost see the past, a reminder of flowing summers, of laughter echoing across the water. It was nostalgia, painted in frost. If you're listening now, breathe slowly and imagine that reflection, the soft shimmer, the way the night wraps around the river like a blanket. In that stillness, even the cold feels gentle. That's how it was then, harsh, yet somehow peaceful. The kind of beauty that only silence can teach. The still rivers brought a strange kind of unity. Those who once lived by different means, farmers, hunters, traders, now shared the same frozen path. They depended on one another, exchanged goods, shared warmth, shared words. The cold had erased differences. It had made everyone equal in its quiet command. In time, people stopped fearing the frozen rivers. They began to respect them, not as roads, not as enemies, but as living things resting beneath their feet. They learned to walk lightly, to listen closely, to move with care. It was as if the river itself was teaching them patience, reminding them that strength is not noise, but persistence. And so, under the pale light of endless winter, life continued beside the silent waters. Fires burned along the banks, footprints marked paths across the ice, and the people, fragile yet unbroken, learned that stillness was not death. It was only a pause, a breath, before the world remembered how to move again. The deeper winter pressed, the more familiar the frozen rivers became. What once felt dangerous now seemed dependable, a part of life's daily rhythm. People could tell the difference between safe ice and brittle ice just by the tone it made underfoot. A deep hum meant strength, a sharp echo meant warning. The land itself had become their teacher, and they moved across it with quiet understanding. Every journey across the river felt like walking through time. The stillness carried an ancient kind of peace, one that softened even the hardest hearts. Travelers paused midway, looking down through cracks in the ice, watching the faint shadows of water moving below. It reminded them that even in stillness, something unseen always flowed: life, faith, and the will to continue. The nights were long, but the river reflected them beautifully. The moon lay flat across the ice, stretching in silver shapes, as though the sky had come down to rest. People would gather along the banks to watch in silence. The firelight from nearby homes flickered across the surface, and for a moment, it was hard to tell where earth ended and sky began. That illusion felt like peace. When storms rolled in, the rivers disappeared beneath walls of snow. The paths vanished, and travelers relied on memory to find their way home. Sometimes, they followed the faint sound of flowing water deep beneath their feet, the same quiet whisper that had guided generations before them. Even when unseen, the river's voice never left them. It was the thread that held their world together. Fishermen still returned, bundled in layers, faces hidden behind frost. Their days began before the sun and ended long after it had vanished. They worked not for profit, but for persistence. Each small catch was a story, each frozen rope a testament to patience. Around their fires, they shared silent nods. No celebration, no boasting, just the calm satisfaction of endurance. One evening, the sky cleared completely. For the first time in months, the stars burned bright and countless. The ice glowed faintly blue beneath them, as though the heavens had descended into the river itself. People stepped outside to look, whispering softly, not daring to break the beauty with sound. That night, they slept peacefully, comforted by the reminder that even in coldness, there was light. If you listen now, imagine the sound, the faint creak of ice shifting, the muffled breeze passing over snow, the low crackle of fires nearby. That's what they heard then. The world was stripped down to its essence: sound, breath, heartbeat. In that simplicity, they found something rare, a feeling that all of creation was at rest. The children of that generation would grow up remembering these rivers, not as frozen barriers, but as guardians. They would tell stories of how the ice once became their road, their bridge, their teacher. Those stories weren't of fear, but of respect. They had learned that the world could be both cruel and kind, and often both at once. Eventually, the thaw came softly, as all endings do. It didn't shout, it whispered. The ice began to thin, cracking like fragile glass under sunlight. People watched the first trickles of water slide free, glimmering between the breaks. It was the sound of life returning, hesitant, gentle, and achingly beautiful. The frozen paths they had once trusted now grew dangerous again. A misplaced step could mean sinking through, so they began to step back, letting the rivers wake on their own. There was no sorrow in their retreat, only quiet gratitude. The ice had served them well. Now it was time to let it go. The first true flow of water came at dusk. It rippled softly, carrying away bits of ice like pieces of memory. People gathered on the banks, not to celebrate, but to listen. The sound of running water, a sound they had nearly forgotten, filled their hearts with something that felt like relief. Some smiled, others closed their eyes and simply breathed. For days, the rivers sang louder. Birds returned, testing the edges of thawing banks. The water glistened under the pale sunlight, and reflections of movement danced across the ceilings of nearby homes. The stillness was gone, replaced by motion, not rushed, not wild, just natural. The world had remembered itself. If you were standing there, you would have seen how slowly they approached the banks, how reverently they touched the water. It was cold, yes, but it was alive. It carried away not just the ice, but the heaviness of long waiting. The river had been their mirror through hardship, and now it became their reminder that every silence ends with a return to sound. The people spoke softly of that winter for years afterward. They remembered how the rivers had fallen silent, and how they had learned to listen. The cold had made them cautious, but it had also made them wise. Stillness had taught them what rushing never could, that patience is its own form of strength. And so, the stillness of the rivers became a memory woven into their lives. It was no longer a season of fear, but of learning. A story told beside future fires, whispered like a lullaby to children on cold nights, reminding them that even when life freezes over, beneath it, the current always flows. When the cold refused to leave, people began to turn inward, not just into their homes, but into their own patience. The snow had swallowed roads and fields, and now the only world that mattered was the space within their walls. Shelter was no longer a place of comfort. It was survival itself. Every creak of wood, every draft of wind, became part of a daily conversation with the elements. The people didn't fight the cold anymore. They learned to live alongside it. The first shelters were simple, built from whatever could be found. Stones from riverbanks, logs from fallen trees, packed snow hardened into walls. Each village had its own methods, its own small secrets passed from one generation to the next. They learned that the cold could not be defeated, but it could be managed. And so, they built not for beauty, but for endurance, homes shaped by the wind, sealed by the will to keep breathing. Inside, the air was heavy and dim. Fires burned low to preserve wood, and the smoke clung to the rafters, turning everything a soft grey. Yet there was comfort in that gloom. It meant the house was warm enough to hold smoke, warm enough to keep life in. Families spoke little. The crackle of fire and the sigh of wind against the roof were language enough. Survival had become an unspoken understanding shared by all. Each home carried its own rhythm. Some built raised sleeping areas lined with straw and hides to stay above the cold floor. Others hung thick curtains inside to trap heat in smaller spaces. It wasn't grand engineering, but it worked. The people learned through observation, from nature, from animals burrowed in the snow, from each other. Every improvement was a small triumph, every night of warmth a quiet victory. You could walk through the village and see smoke curling from chimneys like ribbons of life. Beneath each roof was a world, a family huddled close, a pot simmering slowly, an old story being told to keep fear at bay. The shelters didn't just keep out the cold, they held in memories, laughter, and the soft rhythm of breathing together. Each home was a heartbeat in the frozen landscape. The builders were not artisans or architects. They were ordinary people guided by necessity. They used what they had, clay, straw, snow, wood, and shaped it with bare hands. There was no time for design, only purpose. Yet somehow, their crude work held grace. The walls, uneven and rough, stood as proof of determination. Even beauty, it seemed, could grow from desperation. Some families built their shelters partly underground, burrowing into hillsides to trap the earth's natural warmth. The walls were cool to the touch, but steady. The ground did not change with the wind. It stayed loyal, firm, and constant. In those quiet burrows, the sounds of the storm above became distant, like a fading memory. The world outside raged, but within, there was calm. The scent inside these shelters was distinct: smoke, damp wool, cooked grains, and the faint sweetness of stored hay. It was the smell of survival. People stopped noticing it after a while. It became part of them. When they stepped outside, the air felt sharp and empty by comparison, as though something essential had been left behind in the warmth. Children adapted quickly. They learned how to feed the fire, how to seal cracks with rags or snow, how to move quietly so as not to let the cold slip in. Even their games changed, played with carved sticks and shadows instead of open fields. They found joy in small things: the sound of a log splitting, the sparkle of frost on the window, the feeling of warmth spreading through their hands after touching a flame. The builders often said that a home was alive. It breathed, it listened, it remembered. They would press their palms against the walls and feel the vibration of wind outside, then add more snow or straw where the sound grew loudest. They treated their shelters like companions, things to be cared for and respected. The bond between human and home had never been stronger. If you could walk among them then, you'd hear the steady rhythm of repair, hammers against wood, footsteps crunching in snow, soft voices working in harmony. No one complained. The act of building, of maintaining, became a form of prayer, a way to thank the Almighty for what they still had: hands that could build, hearts that could endure, and warmth that still answered when called. At night, when all the work was done, the villagers sat together by the fire, watching sparks drift upward. They didn't speak of fear anymore. They had built their safety with their own hands. Outside, the wind could roar, but inside, they were calm. The walls held, and the fire spoke in its gentle language of crackles and sighs. Sometimes, travelers would arrive, drawn by the promise of shelter. No one was turned away. A roof, no matter how small, always had room for one more. They shared what little food they had and made space beside the fire. The warmth grew, not because the fire was larger, but because kindness made it stronger. Each home told its own story: the way the walls leaned, the patches repaired after a storm, the faint marks left by small hands pressing into the snow for insulation. These imperfections were not flaws but signatures, proof that survival had a face, a family, and a heart. In their quiet way, the shelters had become symbols of unity, faith, and gratitude. And as the endless winter dragged on, it became clear: the people no longer feared the cold. They had mastered it, not through conquest, but through harmony. Their shelters were not fortresses against nature, but sanctuaries within it. The cold might have ruled the land, but warmth ruled their hearts. As the nights grew longer, the shelters became worlds of their own, small universes bound by flickering firelight. People began to decorate them in the simplest ways. Bits of cloth hung near the walls, dried flowers from months past tied with string, marks carved into beams to count the passing days. These gestures weren't about beauty, they were about remembrance. They reminded everyone that even when surrounded by cold, humanity could still create warmth through meaning. The fire became the center of life. Everything revolved around it: meals, conversations, silence, and prayer. Its light shaped the walls, painting faces in shades of amber and shadow. When it burned low, people leaned closer, whispering to it like an old friend. They said it had a temper, that it needed care and attention. And so, every few hours, someone would rise to feed it, ensuring the heart of the home never stopped beating. Outside, the shelters looked fragile, small dots of light scattered across the frozen land. But step inside, and they felt indestructible. The cold stopped at the threshold, humbled by human hands. There was a peace there that no storm could touch. Even the smallest homes felt vast inside, filled not with space, but with togetherness. In the deepest part of winter, some families joined shelters together, connecting their homes with covered tunnels of packed snow. They shared warmth, food, and laughter through those narrow passageways. The sound of footsteps traveling between homes became a sign of comfort. It meant that no one was alone, that the village still breathed as one body under the blanket of frost. Those who built and maintained these shelters became quiet heroes. They never sought recognition, yet their hands carried the weight of survival. Every repaired roof, every sealed crack, was an act of love, not loud or proud, but deeply human. The builders taught everyone that survival wasn't about strength, but about care. And care, they learned, was the purest form of endurance. Sometimes, the sound of the wind grew too strong, shaking the walls. In those moments, everyone would fall silent, listening to the storm's voice. The world outside raged, but inside, no one panicked. They had faith in what they had built, faith in the hands that worked together, in the warmth they had shared. When the storm passed, they would smile softly and return to their rhythm, as if nothing had changed. If you were sitting with them, you might have noticed the rhythm of life itself in those shelters, the slow breathing of sleep, the crackle of fire, the gentle clinking of a pot. It was quiet, yes, but never empty. Silence became a melody, one that soothed the mind and slowed the heart. The people had learned how to live with less, and in doing so, they had found peace. When supplies began to thin, the shelters became even more important. They conserved heat, saved energy, and kept families close. People would gather in the warmest home, sharing whatever food they could find. The nights became gatherings of voices, stories, songs, and gentle laughter drifting through the air. Even in hunger, they found a way to make the darkness feel kind. Some days, when the sky was clear and the snow sparkled, builders would step outside to inspect their work. The sunlight reflected off the roofs, glowing faintly against the white horizon. They would stand quietly, their breath rising in clouds, knowing that their work, these humble homes, were the difference between despair and survival. That realization filled them with gratitude rather than pride. The cold tried many times to invade, creeping through cracks, pressing against doors. But it always met resistance, not from walls alone, but from hearts. The people had become part of their shelters, bound to them through effort and trust. They had built not just with hands, but with patience, with hope, with faith in the days to come. As the winter began to fade, the shelters bore its marks. The walls were scarred, the roofs darkened by smoke. But no one saw these as flaws. To them, the signs of wear were stories, proof that the cold had been faced and overcome. The homes stood as silent monuments to endurance, glowing gently under the late winter sun. Children would one day trace those marks with their fingers, listening to the stories their parents told. They would hear about the long nights, the frozen winds, the laughter by the fire. And they would understand that strength was not loud or bold. It was quiet, steady, and built from compassion. If you're listening now, imagine the warmth of that fire, the glow on the walls, the slow rhythm of breathing, the safety in every heartbeat. That's how it felt to live inside those shelters, protected not by walls alone, but by one another. The outside world could freeze 1,000 times, but inside, life stayed gentle and warm. And so, when the coldest winter finally began to loosen its grip, people did not rush to leave their homes. They stayed a little longer by the fire, resting in the comfort they had built. The shelters had become more than protection. They were memories carved into the soul of a generation. Proof that even in a world of ice, humanity could still build warmth that lasted far beyond the season. When the world had been cold for too long, warmth began to take a new form. It no longer came from fire or sunlight, but from something quieter, a feeling people carried within them, a small and steady light that refused to fade. It was hope, though no one called it that aloud. To speak it might have broken it. Instead, they lived it in small ways, in the way they shared, in the way they waited, and in the way they looked at the horizon each morning, even when it showed nothing but snow. The days had lost their color. The sky was pale and endless, the air thick and unmoving. Yet, inside the shelters, people began to find rhythm again. They sang softly while tending fires, they told stories to the young, and they spoke of the world that used to be green. Hope, they learned, was not a loud thing. It whispered. It reminded them that no season, no matter how long, could last forever. In those quiet homes, storytelling became a lifeline. The elders spoke not of the cold but of spring, of rivers running freely, of the scent of soil after rain, of fields bursting with grain. Their voices filled the rooms like gentle music, and the children listened as though each word was a promise. These weren't just memories, they were maps of what was possible. Through their words, warmth traveled from one heart to another. Sometimes, when the night was long and the wind too loud, the people would fall into silence. They would close their eyes and listen, to the fire, to the wind, to each other's breathing. In that silence, they practiced endurance. Hope did not always feel bright. Often, it felt like stillness, like the calm that comes after tears. They learned to find peace in that quiet, trusting that even in darkness, dawn was moving toward them. The smallest gestures carried meaning. A cup of warm broth offered to a neighbor, a smile exchanged after a long day, a hand extended to steady someone on icy ground. These were sparks of light in a frozen world. Each act reminded them that goodness had not disappeared. It only needed tending, like a small fire in the snow. There were days when faith wavered. The frost deepened, the storms returned, and the sky felt heavier than ever. But someone would always speak, a voice calm and steady, reminding everyone that every winter in history had ended. It was not philosophy, not poetry, just a simple truth carried by time. And that truth was enough to keep them steady. If you're listening now, imagine sitting among them, the fire soft, the air still, the voices calm and unhurried. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, but full. That's what hope felt like then. Not excitement, not certainty, but rest. The understanding that even if tomorrow looked the same, they would face it together. As the months passed, people began to notice the smallest changes. The snow softened at the edges, the sunlight lingered a few moments longer, the air carried a different scent, faint but new. These were not miracles, only signs. Yet to those who had waited so long, a single drop of melting ice was enough to make them smile. The art of keeping hope was not about pretending the cold wasn't real. It was about acknowledging it, feeling it fully, and choosing to keep walking anyway. The people had learned that courage was not loud or heroic. It was quiet persistence, the decision to keep lighting fires even when the woodpile grew small. Children became the keepers of that light. They laughed easily, played in the snow, and asked endless questions about the world that once was. Their joy was a form of defiance, proof that innocence could survive even the harshest season. When adults grew weary, they watched the children and remembered what hope looked like when it was young. Some evenings, a group would gather just to sit in silence, facing the last glow of the fire. They didn't speak about survival anymore. They spoke about what they would do when the thaw came, where they would plant seeds, how they would rebuild fences, what songs they would sing when the fields turned green again. These conversations were soft, but they carried more power than any grand plan. They were the architecture of tomorrow. Inside every person, something invisible had grown stronger. It wasn't resistance to the cold, but harmony with it. They had stopped fearing it. They had accepted that the frost was part of life, and that even hardship had its place in the story of existence. In accepting it, they found balance. When food ran low, people shared without hesitation. Hope was not kept to oneself. It multiplied through generosity. A family that shared a single loaf often found themselves repaid in ways that could not be measured, with friendship, with laughter, with the warmth of company. Hope, they discovered, grew faster when it was given away. By the time the first signs of thaw reached the rivers and hills, people were already different. They no longer dreamed only of warmth. They had learned how to find peace even in the cold. The season had taught them something that would remain forever, that hope is not a feeling that arrives, but a skill that must be practiced, patiently, every day. And so, as the fires burned low and the wind softened, people began to rest with a calm they had earned. The worst was not behind them yet, but it no longer frightened them. Hope had become part of who they were, not a dream, but a habit of the heart. As the cold continued its quiet rule, people learned to treasure even the smallest comforts. A single sunbeam slipping through a window, the sound of melting snow dripping from the roof, or the warmth of a shared blanket. These moments became more valuable than anything gold could buy. They were tiny proofs that life persisted. The people didn't chase joy anymore. They collected fragments of it, patiently, like embers scattered across the frost. In the evenings, after long days of stillness, the sound of gentle laughter would sometimes rise from the shelters. It was soft, fragile, but real. It wasn't born of happiness, but of gratitude. The people had realized that joy wasn't something you waited for. It was something you built quietly, even when the world seemed empty. That laughter, faint as it was, became a thread that tied them to the promise of spring. There were moments, too, when silence returned heavier than before, when no one spoke, and the wind seemed to press against every wall. During those nights, people didn't try to fill the quiet. They simply let it be, breathing, resting, existing. In that stillness, hope wasn't loud or bright. It was steady, like the heartbeat of the world itself continuing beneath layers of snow. Elders would sit by the fire, eyes half closed, speaking softly to no one in particular. They spoke to the flames, to the air, to time itself, saying things like, "The world always remembers how to be warm." The younger ones would listen without interrupting, their faces calm. These words were not lessons, but lullabies, reminders that patience had its own power. If you imagine that moment, you can almost feel it, the warmth of the fire's glow, the slow rhythm of conversation, the scent of wood and smoke. It was not the excitement of life that filled those rooms, but its gentleness. Hope had stopped being something distant. It had become part of the air itself, something you breathed without realizing. The sky began to change. Clouds thinned, the grey softened, and sometimes a faint line of light appeared on the horizon. The children were the first to notice. They pointed and laughed, shouting that the sun had remembered them. The adults smiled quietly, not wanting to break the spell. The warmth didn't return all at once, but those first rays carried more strength than anyone expected. When snow melted along the roofs, It sounded like music, the steady drip of water, the rhythm of change. People stood outside, closing their eyes to the sound. It was simple, but it felt like hearing the world wake from a long sleep. After so many months of silence, the smallest noises were enough to fill them with peace. They began to prepare, not out of fear, but of faith. Tools were repaired, seeds sorted, and fields inspected under the remaining ice. Each task carried meaning again. They knew the thaw would take time, but they worked anyway, trusting the process as they had trusted the cold. Hope, they realized, was not waiting, it was doing. At night, when the sky turned deep blue and stars scattered across it, the fire still burned in every home. But now, the flames felt different. They were no longer shields against the dark, but companions. The cold outside wasn't gone, but it had softened, tamed not by the weather, but by the hearts of those who had learned to live with it. Sometimes, people would still wake in the middle of the night, hearing the faint howl of wind beyond their walls. But instead of fear, they felt calm. The sound no longer carried danger. It was part of the rhythm of life. The wind had always been there, just as they had always endured. The world had become something they could trust again. Hope had reshaped them. It had softened their voices, steadied their hands, and taught them the grace of patience. They no longer searched for happiness. They created it in small, deliberate ways, in warmth shared, in stories told, in the quiet acceptance of things beyond their control. By the time the rivers began to flow again, hope had become invisible, not spoken, not discussed, but lived. People didn't announce it. They carried it in how they moved, how they looked at one another, how they lit their fires. It had become the unseen foundation of their days. If you're listening now, you might sense that same calm, the slow rhythm of the past and the steady beat of human endurance. History remembers great battles and loud triumphs, but this quiet keeping of hope, is the truest victory of all. It's what keeps us gentle in a harsh world, and patient when warmth feels far away. When the sun finally broke fully through the clouds, no one cheered. They simply watched, smiling softly, feeling the light on their faces. It wasn't joy that filled them, but gratitude, deep, wordless, and calm. They had endured the coldest of seasons, and now they carried within them something far stronger than fire. They carried the art of keeping hope. Long before the people understood the rhythm of the cold, the animals already knew. They had listened to the whispers of the earth, the slow change in the wind, the shifting scent of the air, the quiet retreat of insects. When the first frost touched the ground, the creatures of the world had already begun their silent preparations. In their quiet wisdom lay lessons that no book could teach, lessons of patience, instinct, and survival without complaint. The forests, once alive with the sounds of rustling and birdsong, had fallen into stillness. Only a few shapes moved through the snow, a deer tracing the same path each dawn, a fox pausing near the edge of a frozen stream, a flock of crows perched like black leaves against a pale sky. Every creature had its rhythm, every breath a careful act of balance. In the coldest winter, movement itself became precious. Some animals disappeared altogether, vanishing into burrows and hidden dens. The people used to wonder where they went, beneath the earth, inside hollow trees, or deep within the forest where no wind could reach. In time, they realized these creatures hadn't fled. They had simply learned to rest. While the world slept above, life continued in small, steady heartbeats below the surface. The wolves stayed closest to the villagers. Their howls echoed across frozen valleys at night, not as threats but as songs of hunger and endurance. They, too, struggled. The hunt was harder now, and the snow swallowed their steps. Yet even in scarcity, they moved with grace, never wasting strength, never taking more than they needed. The people listened to those distant cries, understanding them more deeply than they would admit. Hunger, after all, was something they shared. Birds had long since fled to warmer lands, but a few remained, ravens, hardy and clever. They circled above the fields, black wings cutting through the grey sky. To some, they were symbols of warning, to others, symbols of persistence. The villagers began to watch them carefully. If the birds appeared at dawn, it meant the storm would pass. If they vanished, the people stayed close to home. Nature had become their messenger. The livestock, too, had their own ways of enduring. The cows huddled close, their breath turning into clouds that lingered in the still air. Chickens stayed near the hearth, their feathers puffed, their eyes half closed. Even the dogs that guarded the doorsteps learned to lie still, conserving warmth, tails curled tightly around their bodies. Their patience became another kind of wisdom, silent, loyal, enduring. Sometimes, the people marveled at how the animals seemed to know when to move and when to stay. Deer would appear just when the forest seemed empty, their heads raised high, nostrils catching scents of change. Rabbits tunneled through snow, creating invisible highways beneath the world. Even in such desolation, there was motion, quiet, measured, and precise. One night, a hunter returned without prey but with a story. He had followed wolf tracks far into the woods and found, to his surprise, a wolf lying beside its fallen mate. It did not run, did not growl. It simply stayed there, still and mournful. The hunter lowered his weapon and turned back. He later said it was the first time he saw grief in something that was not human. From that day on, the villagers spoke of the wolves differently. The cold, they realized, had softened even the fiercest hearts. If you imagine it now, you can almost hear that winter world, the creak of ice-laden branches, the faint rustle of fur against snow, the rhythmic crack of hooves in the distance. There was no chaos, no noise, only balance. The animals did not fight the season. They adapted to it. Their strength lay not in resistance, but in acceptance. As the weeks turned to months, the relationship between humans and animals deepened. The people began leaving scraps near the edge of the forest, bones, husks, bits of grain. It wasn't charity, it was understanding. They had watched long enough to see that survival wasn't meant to be solitary. Every creature, great or small, carried a piece of the same endurance. Sometimes, at dusk, when the sky glowed faintly gold before fading into blue, villagers would see deer gathered near the outskirts, cautious but no longer fearful. The distance between man and nature had blurred. The cold had united them in quiet struggle, teaching both that life, in all its forms, endures better when it is shared. Deep in the forests, the bears slept through it all, curled into themselves beneath layers of earth and frost. Their rest was not laziness but wisdom, an understanding that the world needed time to pause. The people began to see a kind of hollowness in that rest, a reminder that survival didn't always mean movement. Sometimes it meant stillness. If you close your eyes now, imagine that forest, vast, silent, and filled with sleeping life. Beneath the snow, breath continues. Beneath the ice, water still moves. And within that balance lies the lesson the animals knew all along. Survival is not about strength or noise, but about knowing when to move and when to be still. As the winter deepened, the harmony between people and animals became impossible to ignore. It was as if the frozen world had drawn them closer through silence. Humans began to move with more care, speaking softly, walking slower. They no longer saw animals as distant or lesser, but as fellow travelers through hardship, each playing their part in the same long story of endurance written upon the snow. In the early mornings, footprints crisscrossed the fields like delicate drawings. Some belonged to men returning from the woods, others to foxes searching for food. The patterns intertwined so often that it became impossible to tell where one path ended and another began. In that quiet merging, there was peace. The land belonged to all who respected it, not just those who tamed it. The horses that had once pulled carts now rested more often, their strength conserved. People brushed their coats gently, whispering soft words of gratitude. These animals had carried families, hauled wood, and stood still in endless storms. They had served without complaint, and now, in their stillness, they taught patience. Caring for them became a ritual of humility, a daily reminder that service and gentleness could exist together. There were nights when wolves came close enough for their eyes to glint in the firelight. They no longer frightened anyone. The people knew they were drawn by hunger, not malice. Sometimes, they left food at the edges of the village, quietly, without words or acknowledgement. The next morning, the food would be gone, and new tracks would appear leading back into the forest. No one called it generosity. It was simply coexistence. The dogs of the villagers were restless at first. They could sense the presence of wild kin nearby, and sometimes barked into the night. But as weeks passed, even they grew calm. They lay by the doors, listening to the sounds of wind and distant movement, their ears flicking but their hearts steady. Something in the long winter had taught every creature stillness, a collective surrender to patience. By mid-season, a strange companionship had formed between man and beast. Crows followed hunters from a distance, knowing they would find scraps after each attempt. Deer grazed closer to homes, trusting the quiet figures who watched them from doorways. Even the wild cats that haunted the barns learned not to flee. The cold had stripped away fear, leaving behind a fragile thread of understanding. If you stood in those fields then, you would see how life had learned to balance itself. Breath by breath, step by step, the living world adapted together. The frost had no favorites. It humbled everything equally: tree, man, bird, and beast. And in that humility, creation found peace. Children began to name the animals they saw each morning: the quiet fox, the old stag, the brave crow. To them, these creatures weren't symbols of wilderness anymore, but neighbors. They believed each had a story, a family, a reason to keep going. Their innocence gave the adults comfort. In the eyes of the young, nature was no longer cruel. It was alive, enduring, and patient. Sometimes, late at night, when the fire burned low, a family would hear the faint cry of wolves far beyond the hills. Instead of fear, they felt awe. The sound was ancient, echoing through the snow and time itself. It reminded them that life had been here long before them and would remain long after, endless in the way only creation can be. When the first signs of thaw began, the animals moved before the people did. Birds returned earlier than expected, testing the softened sky. Rabbits appeared near the edges of the forest, pawing at wet earth. The rivers broke open with cracks and groans, and fish darted through cold water like flashes of silver memory. It was as if the world itself exhaled. The people watched quietly, not daring to interrupt. They saw the earth awaken, and they followed its lead. The animals had endured without complaint. Now they thrived without celebration. It was the natural rhythm of life: hardship, rest, renewal, repeating itself as it always had. The livestock stirred first among the humans' companions. Cows lifted their heads, sensing the air's change. Dogs grew restless, sniffing at the melting ground. Even the smallest creatures, mice, sparrows, insects, emerged as if answering a silent call. The stillness that had defined the winter began to loosen its grip. Movement returned, slowly but surely, like the pulse of the world coming back to life. If you listen closely, you might imagine the sound of that awakening: the trickle of water beneath melting ice, the wing beats of crows circling above, the faint rustle of fur and feathers in thawing grass. It was not loud, but steady, the music of life returning, played softly for those patient enough to hear. By the time the snow had melted from the fields, people no longer thought of animals as wild or tame, as useful or useless. They simply saw them as companions in survival. The coldest winter had reminded them of something sacred: that all living beings were threads in the same fabric, each needed to keep the world whole. And so, the people watched the creatures roam once more: wolves in the hills, deer by the rivers, birds filling the sky. They didn't try to own them, nor did they fear them. They simply admired them in silence, as one would admire a reflection of the truth. The animals had survived, and in their survival, humanity saw its own reflection: fragile, patient, and full of quiet grace. When the cold finally began to ease, the world did not wake all at once. It stirred slowly, cautiously, as though afraid the frost might return if it moved too quickly. People stepped outside their shelters, their boots sinking into wet snow, their breath still white in the morning air. The silence that had ruled for months began to shift. Faint voices echoed between homes, soft greetings carried over the fields. After a long winter of stillness, Life was ready to trade again. Barter had never truly stopped during the cold, but now it became the heartbeat of the thaw. The frozen roads, once impassable, softened into paths lined with slush. Villagers carried small bundles, dried herbs, tools, candles, bits of cloth. Each item represented survival, each trade a quiet exchange of trust. Gold had no value here. What mattered was usefulness, and usefulness was life. People began to travel between settlements once more. The sound of footsteps returned to the land, steady, slow, deliberate. A traveler could walk for miles and see nothing but grey sky and melting snow, yet still feel connected to those walking elsewhere. Each road, though empty, carried invisible threads between hearts that had endured the same long season. At every meeting, there was warmth. Not laughter or excitement, that would come later, but a calm recognition. You made it, people would say simply. No titles, no formalities, just the truth spoken with quiet relief. In that moment, every handshake, every nod, felt sacred. Each person alive was a miracle, and every trade was an act of gratitude. Markets formed again, not with noise or chaos, but with care. Tables were built from planks scavenged from barns, covered with cloth, lined with jars of dried roots, candles, and preserved food. People moved slowly through them, speaking softly, offering not just goods but kindness, a piece of bread, a cup of warm broth, a reminder that giving was as valuable as receiving. There was no currency for generosity, but it had the highest worth. A family that had nothing to sell might bring music instead. Someone would hum, another would join in, and soon the air filled with melody. The songs were not of celebration, but of endurance, the kind of music that sounds like breathing. They didn't play for applause, but for presence, for proof that life had rhythm again. You could see it in their eyes, a new softness. The cold had burned away pride, leaving behind only sincerity. People didn't ask for the best deal, they asked what the other needed most. And somehow, what they received always matched what they gave. Barter had become something more than exchange. It had become understanding, an unspoken language of empathy that only hardship could teach. The children followed along, curious and full of energy. They carried baskets and learned to trade small things, a carved toy for a handful of berries, a smooth stone for a ribbon. They didn't yet understand the value of what they held, but they understood the meaning of the smile that followed each trade. It was the simplest form of connection, the same one their parents had relearned. Even the smallest items carried stories. A jar of honey might be all that remained from a summer long gone. A handmade knife might have been used by 3 families. A wool blanket, patched a dozen times, was worth more than anything new. Each object was a memory, proof that time had not stopped, even when the world seemed frozen. When people traded, they didn't count, they thanked. They thanked for patience, for kindness, for company. It was not business, it was conversation, the slow rebuilding of trust that had been broken by distance and silence. The markets were not loud, they hummed gently, like the rivers beside them. If you were there, you might have heard the subtle symphony of survival, boots squelching in the slush, the low murmur of voices, the crack of wooden carts, the soft laughter of children chasing each other between stalls. It wasn't grandeur, but it was life, simple, humble, and true. There was a rule that no one spoke but everyone followed. Never take more than you can carry, and always give what you can spare. It kept the markets balanced and the people kind. The cold had taught them that greed was useless, but compassion could feed an entire village. Sometimes, travelers from faraway towns would arrive, bringing news of other places that had also survived. Their stories spread quickly, traded like the finest goods. One told of a river that had already broken free of ice, another of a valley where the first shoots of green had appeared. Every tale of warmth was worth more than gold. And so, the people bartered and shared and listened, not because they wanted wealth, but because they wanted connection. The world was waking again, and every voice, every act of giving, every step on muddy ground was proof that life, fragile and precious, had chosen to continue. As spring crept closer, The exchanges between villages grew more frequent. Paths that had once been buried under snow were now muddy rivers of footsteps. The world smelled of thawing earth and wood smoke, and that scent alone felt like a blessing. Each journey carried purpose, not for riches or conquest, but for connection. In the hush that followed the cold, trade became a kind of prayer, a way for people to speak to one another without words. The traders moved slowly, their carts creaking over soft ground, wheels cutting deep into the thaw. Some carried flour, others wool or dried roots, but most brought stories. A tale of sunlight breaking over the hills could lift spirits more than any bag of grain. Words became currency, and kindness its only measure. The cold had stripped away all that was unnecessary. What remained was what truly mattered, life shared, not hoarded. When two travelers met on the road, they greeted each other like old friends, even if they had never met. The shared memory of survival made introductions unnecessary. They would stop for a moment, exchange what they could, and part again with a quiet nod. There was no bargaining, no competition, only gratitude. In the stillness of the land, generosity became the last true language. Villages began to look alive again. Doors stayed open longer, smoke rose from chimneys, and laughter returned in small, careful bursts. Some began to carve wooden signs marking their homes, not for ownership, but for invitation. The world, once shut tight against the cold, had reopened at heart. Even the air seemed lighter, as though it too was relieved to move freely again. Sometimes, small processions of travelers appeared in the distance, their shadows long against the evening snowmelt. People would step outside to watch, wave, and wait for them to arrive. The visitors always carried something valuable, not in gold or silver, but in presence. Their arrival meant the world was connected again, that life beyond the horizon still breathed. The markets changed, too. They were no longer just places to trade goods, but places to trade hope. People shared seeds for planting, recipes for survival, and advice for the seasons ahead. Every exchange was a small investment in the future, a promise that they believed the world would continue to give as long as they gave in return. Among the most precious things traded were stories of mercy. One woman spoke of a neighbor who had fed her family when she had nothing left. Another told of a traveler who had shared his last candle with strangers in a storm. These stories spread faster than goods, warming hearts far beyond the reach of firelight. In a world that had nearly frozen to silence, compassion became the loudest sound. If you walked through those markets, you would hear it, not music, not shouting, but harmony. The sound of exchange, of understanding. The world was breathing again, and each act of giving was part of that breath. The trade of life had become more than barter. It was faith in motion, faith that what you give away will return to you in another form, another time, another kindness. Children played near the trading tables, their laughter mingling with the murmur of voices. They built tiny markets in the snowmelt, pretending to barter stones and twigs, mimicking their parents' gentle tone. Watching them, the elders smiled. They saw that the next generation would inherit more than survival. They would inherit the memory of compassion. Travelers began to bring gifts from far places, a carved charm, a polished stone, a loaf of bread baked with new grains. No one asked for value. Each item carried meaning, a sign that the world still had wonders left to find. The people had learned that giving freely was its own wealth, and receiving humbly was its own grace. Even as the night stayed cold, the fires burned with new warmth. The people sat closer together, not because they feared the dark, but because they wanted to share the light. There was laughter again, small but genuine, rising like smoke into the clear evening air. After so much stillness, even the simplest sound of joy felt sacred. If you could stand among them, you would see faces softened by the thaw, cheeks red from wind, hands rough from labor, eyes shining with quiet peace. These were not conquerors or heroes. They were caretakers of life, each doing their part to keep the fragile warmth alive. In their giving, they had rediscovered what it meant to be human. The trade of life did not end with the season. It became a rhythm that carried on, through planting, through harvest, through every small kindness that followed. What began as barter had turned into a bond, a promise whispered between people and the earth itself, that life, when shared, multiplies. And so, long after the ice had vanished, the lesson of that season remained. The people remembered not the hunger or the cold, but the kindness. The fire passed from hand to hand, the bread divided without measure, the hope that grew whenever something was given freely. It was a quiet truth, learned in hardship and carried into peace, that survival alone is not enough. Life is meant to be shared. The change began quietly, almost too softly to notice. The kind of shift that lives between moments, a drip from a roof, a breeze that no longer stung, the faint scent of soil beneath the snow. After months of white silence, the world took its first deep breath. People paused in their steps and listened, unsure if the sound they heard was real. It was. The earth was waking. The first signs of thaw never came all at once. They unfolded slowly, like secrets whispered through the air. The snow, once proud and endless, began to retreat in small, humble patches. Beneath it, color returned, dark, rich, and alive. It wasn't beauty in the way summer would be, but it was promise. And after so much cold, promise was enough to bring tears to tired eyes. The rivers, once silent under their glassy armor, began to stir. It started as a murmur beneath the ice, a low, rhythmic pulse, like the earth's own heartbeat returning. Villagers would stand at the edges, eyes closed, and listen. The sound of running water was a song they had nearly forgotten. To hear it again was like remembering hope itself. When the first cracks appeared along the frozen banks, the children were the first to notice. They ran through the melting snow, pointing and shouting with joy. Adults followed more cautiously, smiling despite themselves. The ice didn't collapse all at once. It sighed, groaned, and finally broke apart in shining shards that caught the sunlight. The river was free again. For weeks, the sound of water filled the valleys. It ran over stones, around roots, beneath bridges that had long stood useless. That sound, soft, persistent, became the heartbeat of spring. People didn't speak over it. They listened. It was as if the world itself had begun to hum, softly reminding them that everything lost returns in its own time. In the forests, the snow melted more slowly, dripping from branches in silver lines. Beneath the trees, small patches of moss emerged, bright and defiant. Birds began to return, one by one. Their songs were hesitant at first, as if unsure of their welcome. But each note carried courage. Each echo reminded the people that life never truly disappeared. It only waited for warmth. Some mornings, the frost still came back, coating the world in white again. But it didn't last. The sun now had strength, and even the coldest mornings gave way to light by noon. The villagers learned to smile at these moments, to accept that change came with patience, not haste. The thaw was not a sudden victory, but a slow conversation between winter and spring. People began to open their doors longer. They stepped outside with their faces turned toward the sun, feeling it brush their skin like an old friend's hand. The warmth was faint, almost fragile, but it was enough. Children played in puddles while elders sat quietly on doorsteps, closing their eyes to the brightness. The world looked softer now, edges blurred by light and melting snow. If you imagine it, you can almost feel it yourself, the cool air that carries both chill and warmth, the faint squelch of wet earth beneath boots, the rhythm of water dripping in steady time. It was a symphony of patience. Nothing rushed. Everything returned exactly when it was ready. The people had learned to move with the same rhythm, slow, deliberate, grateful. The thaw revealed what winter had hidden. Lost tools, buried fences, forgotten paths re-emerged from the snow like artifacts of another world. People laughed softly as they rediscovered things they thought gone forever. Even broken items, cracked pots, worn boots, were met with affection. They were relics of endurance, proof of what had survived. Animals appeared again in numbers. Birds darted across the fields, their wings flashing against the pale sky. Foxes trotted along the edges of villages, lean but alive. The sound of bees returned, faint but insistent, like a heartbeat. Even the trees seemed to stretch after their long rest, their branches sighing as the sap began to rise once more. The ground, once frozen and cruel, softened. It yielded underfoot, dark and wet, releasing the scent of earth, deep, clean, and full of memory. The people knelt to touch it, pressing their hands into the mud as though greeting something sacred. It felt warm. It felt alive. For the first time in months, they could feel the world breathing beneath their palms. The sky, too, had changed. The dull grey of winter gave way to colour, pale blues, streaks of gold, and the faint blush of dawn spreading wider each day. The sun lingered longer now, as though reluctant to leave. Light returned not with brilliance, but with kindness. It poured gently across the snow melt, turning puddles into mirrors and shadows into warmth. Sometimes, the people would stop whatever they were doing just to watch the light move across their walls. It had been gone so long that they had forgotten how beautiful ordinary sunlight could be. They didn't speak in those moments. They simply breathed, letting the brightness fill the spaces inside them that winter had emptied. And in that quiet, as the rivers ran, as the air softened, and as the first colors of spring bled slowly back into the world, they understood something profound. The thaw wasn't just the melting of ice. It was the melting of fear, of silence, of the long loneliness that winter had left behind. The earth was healing, and so were they. The thaw spread slowly, touching everything it passed. What began as a trickle became streams, then rivers. The sound of running water followed people wherever they went, a soft, constant whisper that filled the silence left behind by winter. At night, when the stars reflected on the puddles, it seemed as though the sky itself had come down to rest upon the earth. The world was no longer sleeping. It was breathing again. Villagers began to travel farther from home, their boots sinking into mud that squelched beneath each step. The air was heavy with moisture, but it smelled of life. Along the roadsides, small green shoots appeared, timid at first, fragile, yet full of determination. The sight of colour against the grey landscape stirred something deep inside every heart. It was more than beauty. It was renewal. People began to clean what winter had left behind. They repaired roofs, lifted fallen fences, and cleared the soot from their chimneys. Every act of work felt lighter than before. The exhaustion of survival had turned into energy, driven by the return of warmth. The sound of tools, hammers, buckets, laughter, echoed across the hills. Even the smallest chores now carried joy. The rivers, now free from ice, carried pieces of the past downstream, branches, old leaves, bits of frozen debris. Watching them float away, people felt as if the cold itself were being washed clean. Children followed the current, tossing sticks and racing them along the banks. The water sparkled in the sunlight, each ripple a promise that life was in motion again. If you stood by those rivers, you'd feel it. The air soft on your skin, the smell of thawing soil, the sound of water finding its voice. It was more than a season changing. It was a shift inside the spirit of everything living. After months of stillness, motion had returned, gentle, deliberate, but unstoppable. Animals came out of hiding. Birds sang at dawn, rabbits darted through open fields, and the first bees hummed near the early blossoms. The forests no longer seemed haunted but alive. The people watched these creatures with quiet reverence. They had survived the same hardships, endured the same cold. Now, all creation shared the same relief, a sigh that seemed to ripple through the earth itself. The nights grew softer. Frost still touched the windows, but only briefly before retreating. Fires burned lower now, not for survival but for comfort. Families gathered to share stories of the long winter, speaking with gentleness, not sorrow. What had once been fear was now memory, distant, softened by the passing light. Some mornings, the air shimmered with mist rising from the melting snow. It hung low across the fields, turning the world into a dream of silver and light. Walking through it felt like stepping between seasons, one foot in winter, the other in spring. The villagers moved quietly through the fog, as if not to disturb the fragile beauty around them. The thaw also brought sound, the dripping of water from rooftops, the distant call of geese returning north, the slow, rhythmic knocking of wood as the rivers carried it downstream. It was a music older than memory, played not by instruments but by the world itself. People listened without speaking, knowing that no song could ever match the calm of this one. When the first rains fell, they did not bring sorrow. They brought cleansing. The drops were soft, steady, and kind, washing away the remnants of frost. The people stood in the rain with their faces lifted, laughing quietly as the water soaked their clothes. It felt like forgiveness, the earth's way of saying, "You have endured enough." Fields began to open under the warmth. The ground, once frozen and unyielding, invited hands again. Seeds were placed into the soil with reverence, each one a prayer for the future. The farmers moved slowly, not rushing the earth, understanding that everything worth growing took time. Hope had become a rhythm they could trust. If you're listening now, imagine that soil beneath your fingers, cool, damp, alive. Feel the sunlight on your skin, the faint hum of insects returning to the air. That is what the thaw felt like, a reintroduction, a reminder of what life had always been waiting to give back. It was peace, reborn. The thaw reached even the deepest forests. Streams that had been silent for months burst through moss and stone, forming new paths through the roots. Trees dripped with water that glistened like glass in the morning sun. The sound of life returning echoed through every branch. It was as if creation itself was stretching, yawning, waking from a long, heavy dream. The people began to gather again in the evenings, not out of need, but out of joy. They watched the last traces of snow melt away, listened to the rivers sing, and felt warmth settle into their bones. They didn't rush to name the feeling, but they all knew it. It was peace. Not loud, not sudden, just steady and sure, like a heartbeat rediscovered after silence. And as spring finally arrived, they carried with them the memory of that thaw, of patience rewarded, of stillness giving way to song. It reminded them that no winter, no matter how long, could silence the will to live. Beneath every cold season waited the same quiet truth, that life, in its own time, always finds its way back to warmth. When the warmth finally settled, it did not arrive with celebration. There were no festivals, no grand feasts, no shouts of triumph. Instead, there was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a long prayer has been answered. The people moved through the thawed world with reverence, touching the earth as though greeting an old friend returned from a long journey. The snow was gone, but the memory of its weight still lingered in every breath. The fields were dark again, rich and soft. Farmers knelt to feel the soil between their fingers, testing its life, whispering thanks for its return. What had once been frozen solid now crumbled gently, alive beneath their hands. They planted seeds with care, knowing that each one carried not just food, but the story of survival, a bridge between what had been endured and what was yet to come. The rivers, now full and shining, carried their songs freely across the valleys. Their sound filled the air, not loud, but constant, soothing, like the heartbeat of the world itself. Villagers paused along the banks to listen, remembering the months when these same waters had been locked beneath ice. The flow of the river reminded them that even in stillness, life had always been moving. The animals had returned to their rhythms, as if the great winter had been nothing but a passing shadow. Birds filled the sky again, their wings scattering sunlight. Cattle grazed along the meadows, and dogs lay in the grass with eyes half closed, drowsy from warmth. The people watched them with quiet smiles. Nature had not forgotten how to heal, and in its example, they found peace. Every home bore marks of endurance. Smoke stains on ceilings, patched walls, uneven repairs, all traces of the long cold. Yet no one sought to erase them. They were not reminders of suffering, but of strength. The imperfections became part of the beauty, like scars that proved the body had survived. The people understood now that the world did not need to be perfect to be whole. Evenings grew longer and golden. The fires burned gently, no longer desperate for heat, but kept for comfort and memory. Families sat together once more, speaking softly, laughing more freely. Children asked about the winter, their eyes wide with curiosity. The elders told the stories not with sadness, but with calm. They spoke of lessons, of kindness, of patience, of how the cold had tested the soul, and how the soul had learned to be still. If you were there, you would have felt that gentleness. The way time itself seemed to breathe slower. The days were warmer now, but no one rushed. After surviving the endless cold, every small thing felt sacred. The crackle of a hearth, the flutter of curtains in a spring breeze, the distant sound of water, all of it was precious. The ordinary had become a kind of miracle. Some nights, people gathered outside beneath the stars. The sky, once clouded with frost, now stretched wide and clear. They pointed out constellations that had been hidden all winter, tracing their patterns as if rediscovering an old map. The stars shone brighter after the darkness, or perhaps their eyes had simply learned how to see them again. The storytellers spoke most softly then. They told of how silence had once ruled, how firelight had been the only sun. They told of hands that built, hearts that waited, and prayers whispered in the cold. The listeners did not interrupt. They simply sat and breathed with the words, letting them settle into memory. It was not history written in books, but in hearts, a quiet inheritance passed from one generation to the next. Every person carried a private memory of that winter, a face, a moment, a sound. Some remembered the first crack of ice breaking, others the first bird returning, or the smell of thawed soil. These memories were not heavy anymore. They had softened, like ice melting into water, flowing easily through time. They no longer hurt, they healed. There was an understanding that had not existed before. That warmth was never permanent, and neither was cold. The seasons would turn again, and someday another winter would come. But now they knew how to meet it, with calm, with unity, and with faith in what lay beyond it. Endurance, they realized, was not a single act. It was a way of being. If you're listening now, imagine sitting by one of those gentle fires, the night air cool but kind. Imagine hearing the quiet voices of people remembering, not out of fear, but out of gratitude. The sound of their stories blends with the crackle of wood, and in that softness, you feel something familiar, the peace that comes after struggle, the calm that follows the storm. The memory of survival did not belong to any one person. It belonged to everyone. It was shared across families, across fields, across time. It became the rhythm of the villagers, not in the sound of tools or trade, but in the small, steady acts of kindness that continued long after the cold was gone. And as spring deepened and green crept across the land once more, the people carried that memory with them, not as sorrow, but as strength. For though the world would change again, and hardship would someday return, they had learned the truth written quietly in the heart of every winter, that life endures, not because it is easy, but because it is willing. As the season unfolded fully into spring, the world no longer whispered, it sang. The air shimmered with the hum of insects, the rustle of leaves, the rhythm of footsteps on soft ground. Every sound was alive again, laid gently atop the silence that had once defined the winter. And yet, the people did not forget that silence. They carried it like a song remembered, a hymn to patience, to resilience, to the quiet grace of simply continuing. They began to rebuild, not because the cold had broken them, but because it had taught them what mattered. Walls were strengthened, gardens replanted, roofs mended with new care. Each task was done slowly, thoughtfully, with gratitude. They no longer sought perfection, only balance. The earth gave again, and they received it humbly. Their survival had not made them harder. It had made them softer, wiser, more human. The children grew with those stories woven into their lives. They did not know the cold as their parents had, but they saw its memory in the careful way seeds were planted, in the way doors were kept open for travelers, in the way fires were never allowed to die completely. The lessons of endurance had become part of the rhythm of life itself. At dusk, the villages glowed with gentle light. The smoke rising from chimneys looked like threads weaving the heavens to the earth. People lingered outside, speaking quietly, sharing small meals, laughing softly. The harshness of the world seemed far away now, replaced by a calm understanding. That peace was not the absence of struggle, but the presence of gratitude. If you were there, walking among them, you'd feel it. the air gentle on your face, the warmth from the fires, the faint smell of soil and wood smoke. The world no longer felt like something to survive. It felt like something to belong to. Every breath, every shared glance, carried that silent truth, that even the longest night can lead to a tender morning. The storytellers continued their work, not to warn or to teach, but to remind. Their voices flowed softly through the evenings, weaving memory into comfort. They didn't speak of heroes or victories. They spoke of ordinary people, builders, mothers, travelers, farmers, who had faced the endless cold and refused to let it take their kindness. Those stories were not about hardship. They were about love that endured quietly through it. The rivers gleamed beneath the moon, carrying reflections of starlight toward the distant sea. People often walked to their banks just to watch. The moving water reminded them of time, how it flows, how it heals, how it never forgets but always forgives. The memory of the frozen season was still there, somewhere beneath the surface, but it no longer hurt. It was simply part of the river's song. There were moments of deep reflection. Some would sit alone at twilight, remembering names, faces, or days now long past. Yet, instead of sadness, there was peace. To remember was not to grieve anymore. It was to honor. The winter had taken much, but it had also given something precious, the ability to see beauty even in stillness, meaning even in struggle. Life had become simple again. Meals shared by open windows, tools drying in the sun, the soft chatter of children playing where snow once lay deep. Nothing grand, nothing loud. Just life, steady and complete. The people had learned that the smallest moments often carry the greatest weight, and that survival, in the end, is a collection of such moments held gently together. If you listen closely, even now, you can almost hear it, the faint echo of that distant winter, the sigh of wind against wood, the murmur of people gathered close. It's not a story of suffering. It's a story of endurance, of ordinary courage, of the warmth that grows in the hearts of those who refuse to give up on one another. And when the sun dipped low each evening, and the shadows lengthened across the fields, they would light their fires not because of fear, but because of tradition. The flame, small and steady, reminded them of everything they had learned, that even when the world freezes, something within us must always stay warm. The elders would often end their stories the same way, by closing their eyes and smiling. "We lived," they'd say softly. "We endured. And we remembered." The children would grow quiet then, lulled by those words, and the night would settle like a blanket over the village. Peace had returned, not in noise or glory, but in stillness. The coldest winter in history had ended long ago, but its memory lingered in every sunrise, in every shared meal, in every fire kindled at dusk. It had become more than history. It had become wisdom. The world had moved on, but the lesson remained, that life's truest warmth is not found in fire or sunlight, but in the quiet kindnesses that carry us through the cold. And now, as this story draws to a close, take a slow breath and let the calm settle in. The same stillness that comforted them can comfort you too, soft, gentle, endless. The night outside is quiet. The fire burns low. The world, once again, is at peace. Thank you for listening to this story, for walking through the cold, the silence, and the light with me. May your night be calm, your thoughts gentle, and your heart warm. Sleep peacefully, knowing that just like them, you have endured, and you, too, carry the quiet memory of survival.